Welcome back, everybody. Today, we're going to take a deep dive into something that I know can be a real pain, vCenter service failures.
Oh,
You're probably
yeah.
listening to this because your vCenter has decided to take a break, maybe even right after the license expired.
Yeah.
And I know that can be really stressful, especially if it impacts, systems that are critical.
Oh, yeah.
But don't worry, we're going to get you back on track. And
Ugh.
to help us navigate this, we've got an expert who practically lives and breathes VMware.
It's true. I've seen a lot of vCenter issues, so we'll figure this out.
Yeah, I bet you have. Okay, so first off, let's just make sure we're all on the same page about what a vCenter failure actually looks like.
Yeah.
What are some of the symptoms that someone might experience?
Well, sometimes it's obvious. You get error messages when you're trying to log in. Sometimes it's more subtle, like maybe virtual machines are running slowly or you're having trouble connecting to your ESXi hosts.
Yeah.
It can be kind of a mystery sometimes.
Yeah, it can be a little bit of a mystery. And while an expired license certainly doesn't help, it's usually not the direct cause of these issues, is it?
Yeah, that's a really good point. It's easy to assume that the license is the problem, but there are other factors at play. One of the most common reasons for vCenter to go down is actually something you might not expect: expired SSL certificates.
Expired certificates, huh?
Yeah.
I wouldn't have guessed that.
Yeah.
Can you tell me a little bit more about why these certificates are so important?
So think of SSL certificates kind of like digital security badges. They allow the different parts of your vCenter system to communicate securely. And the security token service certificate, or the STS certificate, that one's especially critical because it handles authentication and authorization.
So the STS certificate is verifying everyone's identity before allowing access.
Exactly.
Okay, what happens when that expires?
It's kind of like the security guard at a concert suddenly forgetting how to check tickets. You
Okay.
know, the whole system grinds to a halt because nothing can properly authenticate.
That's a great analogy. I like that. So expired certificates can lead to some major disruptions. What about other potential causes? You mentioned disk space in our pre-show notes, and that surprised me.
Oh, yeah. You would be surprised how often overlooked disk space leads to problems with vCenter. Even if you think you've got plenty of storage, hidden culprits like log files or old archive disks, they can fill up and essentially choke the system.
It's like letting your email inbox overflow, but instead of just annoying messages, it's impacting critical systems.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. So we've identified a couple of usual suspects here. How do we actually address these issues? Let's start with those pesky certificates. What's the first step someone should take if they suspect an expired certificate?
So VMware actually provides this handy script called checkstats.pia.
Yeah.
You can think of it like a little detective, examining your STS certificates and seeing if they're expired or about to expire.
Okay, so check.p and will tell us if we've got a problem. How do we actually fix those expired certificates?
Well, that's where the VMware Certificate Manager comes in. It's a tool that allows you to renew or replace certificates.
Gotcha. So checkests.py is our diagnostic tool, and Certificate Manager is the solution.
Exactly.
Okay.
And one thing to remember is that if you've got both STS certificates and other certificates expired, you always want to tackle the STS certificates first.
That makes sense. Fix the foundation before you start working on the walls.
Right.
Speaking of foundations, let's move on to that sneaky disk space issue. How do we even begin to investigate where all that space is going?
So you have a couple of options. If you prefer something visual, you can start with the vCenter Server Management Interface. It's like a control panel that lets you see storage usage.
And what about for those of us that like to get a little more hands-on?
Well, if you're comfortable with the command line, the DFH command is your best friend.
Okay.
It's basically a quick overview of all your disks and how much space is being used.
So DFH shows us exactly where the digital dust bunnies are hiding. What are some common areas to look out for?
One place to keep a close eye on is storage log. That's where a lot of log files can accumulate.
Storage log, got it. All right, so let's say we've confirmed that disk space is indeed the issue. What are some strategies for reclaiming that precious storage?
Well, the first step is you want to get rid of anything unnecessary, like old log files or archives that you don't need.
Digital spring cleaning.
Exactly.
What if even after deleting unnecessary files, we're still tight on space?
Then you might have to think about expanding your storage, like adding more disks or allocating more space.
Okay, so we've got our diagnostic tools and cleanup strategies for certificates and disk space.
Mm-hmm.
But there's still the issue of that expired license looming over us.
Yeah, the license. Well, it doesn't directly cause vCenter to fail. It definitely complicates
Yeah.
things, especially if you need immediate support.
Yeah, especially because that usually means no support contract. Are there any workarounds in this situation?
You do have a couple options. You can try reaching out to VMware or your vendor and request a temporary evaluation license. That can buy you a little bit of time to either renew your license or address the underlying issues.
It's like a grace period to get things sorted out. What if an evaluation license isn't an option? Are we completely stuck?
Not necessarily. Remember your ESXi hosts, they're still running those virtual machines. You can actually connect directly to each host using its IP address and manage the VMs from there.
Okay, so even with vCenter down and an expired license, we're not completely helpless. That's a relief. Let's assume we've addressed the certificate and disk space issues. What's the next step in bringing our vCenter back to life?
Well, oftentimes the simplest solution is the best, and that's a reboot.
Okay.
Once you've taken care of those underlying problems, rebooting that vCenter server appliance, or VCSA, can usually get things working again.
A classic IT solution. Rebooting. What should somebody do after the reboot?
Monitor the situation, use that vCenter server management interface to check the status of all the services that were down before, make sure everything comes back online.
So we're looking for those green lights. What if some services are still giving us trouble, even after the reboot?
Well, if a critical service like that VMware vCenter service is still acting up, you can try another script called fixeds.esh. It's kind of a specialized mechanic for the STS service.
Reboot, monitor, and if needed, call in the fixeds.esh cavalry.
Exactly. Now, before we wrap up this section, I want to touch on one more scenario. It's more of a user error, but it's surprisingly common.
All right, let's hear it.
So imagine this. You've gone through all this troubleshooting, you're finally ready to log back into vCenter, and then it hits you. You can't remember your SSO administrator password.
Oh no, the dreaded password problem. We've all been there. Is there any hope in this situation?
Don't worry, there is. VMware has documented procedures for resetting that SSO administrator password.
Okay.
You might have to do a little digging, but it is possible.
That's good to know. This is probably a good time to remind everyone about good password hygiene.
Couldn't agree more. Keep those passwords secure, document them, and consider using a password manager.
Great advice. Speaking of resources, are there any other tools that we should have in our vCenter troubleshooting arsenal?
VMware has a whole suite of diagnostic tools that can be really helpful.
Can you give us some specific examples?
Sure. One that I often recommend is ELS Doctor. It's designed specifically to diagnose problems with certificates. And of course, we already talked about fixeds.esh, which is great for STS issues.
ELS Doctor for certificates, fixeds.esh for STS.
Got it. Where can we find these tools?
The VMware Knowledge Base is your go-to resource. It's got articles, guides, downloads for just about any issue you might run into.
Bookmarking that right now. That's been really helpful.
Glad to hear it. Now let's move on to part 2. We'll explore some of those less obvious culprits behind vCenter failures, like issues with the database and network connectivity.
Sounds good.
Stay tuned.
All right, so we've covered some of the big ones when it comes to vCenter failures. Certificates, disk space, even those tricky licenses. But I have a feeling there's more to the story, right? What are some of the less obvious issues that might be lurking beneath the surface? You know, one area that people often overlook is the vCenter Server Appliance Database, or the VCSA database.
Okay.
Think of it like the brain of vCenter, storing all those configurations and settings.
Okay, so if the brain's not working right, the whole system is going to feel the effects.
Exactly. And just like our own brains, that VCSA database needs regular care and attention. Over time, it can become fragmented or even corrupted, and that can lead to performance issues or even, complete service failures.
So how do we keep the VCSA database running smoothly? What kind of maintenance should we be doing?
Well, the first and most important step is backups.
Okay. Backups are crucial for any system, especially one as important as vCenter. But backups alone aren't enough, are they?
Right. You also need to perform some routine checks and maintenance tasks to make sure the database is in good shape.
What kind of tasks? Is this something we can do ourselves, or do we need to call in a specialist?
VMware actually provides a tool called the vCenter Server Appliance Management Interface, or VMI for short. It gives you access to a lot of different database management options.
VMI. Okay, another acronym to add to our list.
Yeah.
Sounds like a powerful tool. What can we do with it?
You can use VMI to check the overall health of the database. You can do defragmentation, even compact the database to optimize performance.
So regular checkups and maintenance with VMI can prevent a lot of potential database problems down the road.
Absolutely.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
What about other areas that can impact vCenter performance?
Another area that's often overlooked is network connectivity.
Okay.
Even if your physical network is solid, there can be some subtle configuration issues or just little glitches that can really mess with vCenter.
Ah, yes, the network. Always a potential source of mystery and frustration.
Absolutely.
What are some of the network gremlins we might encounter?
Well, DNS resolution is a common one. If vCenter can't properly resolve host names or IP addresses, it can lead to communication breakdowns.
So it's like trying to send an email, but you've got the wrong address.
Exactly.
The message might be fine, but it's never going to get there.
Another potential issue is firewall configuration. If your firewall is too restrictive, it can block essential traffic.
So we need to make sure the firewall isn't being overprotective.
Right.
Right.
It's all about finding that balance between security and functionality.
Okay.
And of course, we can't forget about network latency or packet loss. If the connection is slow or unreliable, it's going to impact performance.
So when we're troubleshooting vCenter, it's always a good idea to rule out any network-related issues. What are some tools that we can use to diagnose connectivity problems?
Well, there are a few that can help. Ping is a simple but effective way to test basic connectivity.
Yeah.
Traceroute can be used to actually trace the path that network traffic takes, which can help you identify bottlenecks. And then there's NSLookup, which you can use to make sure DNS resolution is working properly.
Those are good ones to have in our arsenal. We talked earlier about how expired licenses don't directly cause vCenter to crash, but they can make things more complicated. Can you expand on that a bit? What are some of the limitations we might encounter with an expired license?
Well, one of the biggest impacts is on support. If you run into a major issue, you're not going to be able to open a support ticket with VMware without a valid license.
So it's like having car trouble, but your insurance is expired.
Yeah, good analogy.
You might be able to fix it yourself, but if you need professional help, you're out of luck.
Exactly. And depending on your licensing terms, you might also be restricted from adding new hosts or virtual machines.
So it's like hitting a capacity limit.
Right. And you might lose access to certain features or updates.
So even though vCenter might technically keep running with an expired license, our options are pretty limited. Definitely best to stay on top of those renewals.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. Certificates, disk space, databases, network connectivity, and the fun of an expired license.
Yeah, it's a lot to keep track of.
It's been a real crash course in vCenter troubleshooting. But I have a feeling you've got even more wisdom to share with us. So let's delve into some more advanced techniques in part 3.
Okay, so we've explored a whole bunch of potential reasons why your vCenter might be giving you a hard time. Some obvious, some not so obvious. But now I think it's time to arm ourselves with some more advanced troubleshooting techniques. What are some of the tools and strategies that can really help us crack those tough vCenter cases?
Well, one technique that often gets overlooked but is super powerful is log file analysis.
Okay.
Think of log files like a detailed history of everything that happens within vCenter.
Okay.
They can provide some really valuable clues when things start going wrong.
Yeah, I can definitely see how log files would be helpful. But I'm not going to lie, they can be a little bit intimidating. Where do we even begin?
Right. So vCenter generates a lot of log files. They cover different components and services, and knowing where to find them and how to read them is key.
So it's not just like one giant log file that we have to try to make sense of.
Right. Okay. Where are these logs typically located?
So most of the vCenter log files are stored in specific directories on the clients. And a common location is varlog venware.
Okay, varlog VMware, got it. But even if we find the right log files, they're probably not exactly, light reading.
You're right, they can be pretty technical. But VMware provides good documentation. It explains, the different types of logs and what all that information means.
So we need to learn the language of vCenter log files.
Yes.
Any tips for navigating those digital mazes?
Sure. So one essential command is grep. It lets you search for keywords or patterns within a file or even a whole directory. Like, let's say you're having trouble with the STS service. You could use grep to search for STS in the log files.
So grep can help us pinpoint exactly what we need in those massive log files.
Right.
What about other tools?
Another useful one is tail. It lets you see the last few lines of a file, which is handy for monitoring things in real time.
Grep for targeted searches, tail for real-time monitoring. I'm writing all this down. Anything else you want to add about log files?
One more really important thing. Log files, they can get huge and they can actually take up all your disk space.
Oh, wow.
So you want to set up what's called a log rotation policy to make sure that doesn't happen.
Log rotation, another item for that vCenter maintenance checklist. It's amazing how many issues we can avoid if we just stay on top of things.
Proactive maintenance is key.
It is. All right, let's shift gears a little bit and talk about another cool troubleshooting technique. Using the vSphere client to access the VCSA shell.
Okay.
The VCSA shell, that sounds a little bit like we're venturing into the matrix here.
It might sound intimidating, but it's super helpful. It basically gives you direct command line access to the appliance.
So we can bypass the graphical interface and get down to some serious system-level commands.
Exactly. You can run diagnostics, you can change configurations, you can even access troubleshooting tools that aren't available through the regular interface.
I can see the appeal.
Yeah.
How do we access this magical shell?
It's easier than you think. Log into the vSphere client, go to the vCenter server, and then under the Configure tab, you'll see Access, and there's an option to Launch Shell.
Launch shell. I like it.
Think of it like gaining more control over your environment.
Okay, so log files and the VCSA shell. Those are some powerful tools. What other advanced techniques should we be aware of?
Well, let's talk about performance monitoring.
Okay.
vCenter provides a ton of performance data that can help you pinpoint bottlenecks, spot trends and catch problems before they become big headaches.
Performance monitoring sounds crucial for any vCenter admin that wants to keep things running smoothly. How do we access this performance data?
You can actually find it right in the vSphere client. You'll be able to see charts and stats for all sorts of things like CPU usage, memory consumption, network traffic.
So we can actually visualize what's happening inside our vCenter environment.
Exactly. And you can see how things change over time, which can be super helpful in identifying potential issues.
But how do we know what's normal and what's not? What should we be looking for in all this data?
That's where establishing baselines comes in. You need to understand what normal performance looks like for your specific environment, so that way you can spot any deviations that might signal a problem.
So know what normal looks like so we can recognize when something is off.
Precisely. And once you have a good baseline, you can even set up alerts so that you get notified if anything goes above a certain threshold.
Okay. It's like having an early warning system for our vCenter environment.
Exactly.
Alerts, baselines, performance monitoring, it's all starting to click. I feel a lot more prepared to deal with whatever vCenter throws at me.
That's great. Just remember, the learning never stops.
True.
VMware documentation, those resources are always being updated, so stay current on the latest and greatest.
VMware documentation, gotta love it.
Absolutely. And don't forget the power of community. There are tons of forums and blogs, online communities filled with people who've been there and done that. They're always happy to help.
It's amazing how much knowledge and support is out there when you know where to look. Well, I think we've reached the end of our deep dive into vCenter troubleshooting.
We covered a lot of ground.
We did. We've gone from the basics all the way to some pretty advanced stuff, and I feel like I've gained a whole new level of understanding and definitely confidence when it comes to vCenter.
That's awesome. The main thing is, don't panic, use those resources, and never stop learning.
Wise words. A huge thank you to our expert for sharing all of that incredible knowledge and insight today. I've really enjoyed this.
My pleasure.
And all of our listeners out there, thank you for joining us on this deep dive. Remember, you have everything you need to tackle those vCenter challenges. Keep exploring, keep learning, and keep those virtual machines humming. Until next time, happy troubleshooting.